Excuse me. Security needs to escort this woman out immediately. She clearly doesn't have the proper breeding for an event of this caliber. Victoria Ashford's declaration rang through Lincoln Center's grand foyer like a death knell, her diamond-encrusted fingers pointing accusingly at Zara Williams. The young black woman stood calmly beside the evening's centerpiece, a $15 million Stradivarius collection, while Manhattan's elite turned to witness what they assumed would be a swift removal of an unwelcome intruder. Harrison Ashford stepped forward with the confidence of inherited power. "Mother's absolutely right. Look at her. She doesn't even know how to dress appropriately. This is exactly why we need better screening." The crowd pressed closer, smartphones capturing every cruel word as the Ashford family performed their public humiliation with practiced precision. None of them realized they were destroying a $900 million business deal while live-streaming their own downfall to thousands of viewers worldwide. Zara Williams, daughter of media empire builder Marcus Williams and secret architect of her family's corporate strategy, simply smiled and reached for her phone to send a single, devastating text. The VIP entrance of Lincoln Center's most exclusive fundraiser buzzed with the controlled chaos of New York high society. Zara approached the velvet rope with her diamond tier invitation in hand, the same level of access that had cost her father's foundation $75,000. The security guard, a middle-aged man whose eyes swept over her modest cocktail dress with undisguised skepticism, extended his hand for her credentials with unnecessary slowness. "Miss, I'll need to see your invitation and photo identification," he said, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion that hadn't been present for the previous guest, a silver-haired real estate mogul who had sailed through without so much as a pause. Zara handed over both documents with practiced patience, watching as he examined them with theatrical thoroughness. Behind her, other guests filtered through the adjacent entrance with perfunctory nods, their privilege serving as invisible credentials. Victoria Ashford's voice carried over the ambient conversation, her words slicing through the air like perfectly sharpened knives. "Really, one does wonder about the guest list these days. I suppose when you're raising money for outreach programs, you have to expect a certain diversity of attendees." The pause before diversity hung in the air, heavy with implication. Her companions laughed, the sound brittle and knowing. Harrison joined his mother's side, adjusting his platinum cufflinks as he surveyed the crowd. "The important thing is maintaining standards, Mother. Some traditions shouldn't be compromised, regardless of how fashionable inclusion has become." Zara moved past the security checkpoint, her invitation finally approved after a delay that had allowed a dozen other guests to enter unimpeded. She walked toward the main foyer, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that seemed to pause as she passed, resuming once she moved beyond earshot. The centerpiece of tonight's auction was a collection of rare instruments, donated anonymously by what the program described as a prominent entertainment philanthropist. Zara stood before the Stradivarius display, remembering the day her father had acquired it at Christie's, his quiet joy at securing something beautiful to share with the world. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. She was being scrutinized as an outsider in a space her family's generosity had helped create. A server approached with a tray of champagne, offering glasses to the group of collectors beside her, before turning away without acknowledgement. The slight was subtle but unmistakable, part of a pattern Zara had learned to recognize from childhood. She pulled out her phone and opened the voice memo app, speaking quietly. Evening of March 22nd, Lincoln Center Charity Gala. Multiple instances of differential treatment documented from entry through initial reception. Proceeding as planned. She ended the recording and slipped the phone back into her clutch, her expression serene despite the calculated dismissal surrounding her. Harrison Ashford approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. His smile was sharp-edged and practiced, the kind perfected in boardrooms where intimidation masqueraded as charm. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his tone carrying the false politeness of someone addressing an intruder. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Harrison Ashford." He extended his hand, but didn't wait for her to take it before continuing. "I'm just wondering if you might be at the wrong event. This is a rather exclusive gathering." Zara met his gaze steadily, her voice warm despite the chill in his words. "Zara Williams, I have my invitation right here." She produced the diamond card again, noting how his eyes narrowed as he examined it. "Interesting," Harrison murmured, turning the invitation over as if searching for evidence of forgery. "It's just that these particular invitations are quite expensive, and we've had some issues lately with people trying to crash events like this. I'm sure you understand our need to be cautious." The crowd around them had begun to take notice. Several guests slowed their conversations, smartphones discreetly angled in their direction. Victoria Ashford drifted closer, her sapphire dress rustling like silk armor as she positioned herself within earshot. "Perhaps you could tell us how you obtained this invitation," she suggested, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "It's just that we know most of the regular patrons, and you're unfamiliar." Zara's smile never wavered. "I purchased it through the center's patron program, the same way everyone else here did, I imagine." "The patron program?" Harrison's eyebrows lifted in theatrical surprise. "That's quite expensive for someone your age. Might I ask what you do for work?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, carrying implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Several guests had now openly turned to watch the exchange, their conversations dying to whispers. Zara could see phones being lifted, recording the encounter with the casual cruelty of people who viewed confrontation as entertainment. "I work in media," she replied simply, offering no additional details. Victoria stepped forward, her smile as cold as her jewelry. "How fascinating. You know, we've had some concerns about proper security protocols at these events. Harrison, perhaps you should ask security to verify Miss—" She paused meaningfully. "Williams's credentials more thoroughly." Zara remained perfectly still as the suggestion rippled through the nearby crowd. She could feel the weight of judgment settling around her like a shroud, the assumption of guilt that came with being the only person who looked like her in a sea of pale faces. Her phone buzzed silently in her clutch, a text from her assistant confirming that their legal team was on standby. The battle lines were being drawn, invisible but unmistakable. On one side stood the accumulated power of old money and older prejudices. On the other stood a young woman whose true identity remained hidden, her strength measured not in the weight of her bank account, but in the dignity with which she faced their collective assumption of her unworthiness. Security materialized as if summoned by some invisible signal, their black uniforms a stark contrast to the glittering finery surrounding them. The lead guard, badge gleaming under the lobby lights, approached with the measured steps of authority backed by institutional power. "Miss, we're going to need you to step over here for a moment," he announced, his voice carrying across the foyer with uncomfortable clarity. Conversations died as heads turned, the evening's entertainment shifting from music appreciation to public spectacle. Harrison Ashford stepped forward, his face a mask of concerned citizenship. "Officer, this woman claims to have a valid invitation, but frankly, several of us have concerns about the authenticity. We've seen an uptick in people trying to sneak into events like this, and given the circumstances, I think it's best to be thorough." The crowd formed a loose circle around them, phones emerging from designer clutches like modern-day pillories. Victoria Ashford positioned herself at the center, her voice rising with practiced indignation. "I don't want to seem unkind," she began, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. "But this is precisely the sort of situation we were warned about in the board meetings. When you lower standards in the name of inclusion, you inevitably compromise the integrity of the entire event. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled guests. Zara found herself at the center of a human amphitheater, their collective judgment pressing down like physical weight. The guard extended his hand for her identification again, though she had already presented it multiple times. "The problem," Harrison continued, warming to his audience, "is that people like this see our generosity as weakness. They assume they can simply show up wherever they please, regardless of whether they belong." His words carried the weight of inherited authority, each syllable calculated to reinforce the social hierarchy he represented. Zara's voice cut through their collective condemnation with quiet steel. "People like what, exactly, Mr. Ashford?" The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence. Harrison's face flushed, caught between his desire to speak plainly and the awareness that his words were being recorded by dozens of phones. People who don't understand the nature of these events. He stammered, his practiced confidence momentarily shaken. "This isn't a public concert hall. This is a private fundraiser for serious patrons of the arts." Victoria stepped into the breach, her voice sharp with righteous authority. "What my son means is that these events require a certain sophistication, a familiarity with our customs and expectations. Surely you can understand that not everyone is equipped to navigate this environment appropriately." The security guard cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the official nature of the confrontation. "Miss, we're going to need you to come with us for a more detailed verification process. This is standard procedure when questions arise about admission credentials." Zara reached into her clutch and withdrew her phone, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The text she sent was brief. "Phase 1 complete. Initiate legal documentation protocol. Dad, it's time." She looked up at the circle of faces surrounding her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet dignity that seemed to expand in the sudden silence. "I understand your concerns about standards, Mrs. Ashford. I share them completely. The question is whether those standards apply equally to everyone or just to people who look like me." The challenge hung in the air like a sword, its blade catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. The evening was about to take a turn that none of them could have anticipated. The confrontation escalated in waves, each surge building upon the last like a storm gathering strength. Harrison Ashford, emboldened by the crowd's tacit support, stepped forward with renewed confidence. "This has nothing to do with how you look," he declared, his voice carrying across the foyer. "This has to do with belonging, with understanding your place in society. You've clearly made some sort of mistake about the nature of this event." His words drew nods of agreement from the surrounding guests. Victoria positioned herself like a queen holding court, her sapphire dress catching the light as she gestured dismissively. "Really, dear," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Wouldn't you be more comfortable at one of the center's public programs? They have lovely educational concerts on weekends that might be more suitable to your background." The crowd shifted closer, their collective presence forming a wall of silk and privilege. Phones held high captured every angle, the modern equivalent of a public pillory. Someone had already started live streaming, the viewer count climbing steadily as the drama unfolded. A distinguished woman in her 70s stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of old money and older prejudices. "I've been attending these events for 40 years, she announced. "Never in my experience have we had to deal with this sort of disruption. Security protocols exist for a reason." "Exactly." Harrison seized on the support, his confidence fully restored. "This is precisely what happens when institutions abandon their principles in the name of political correctness. Standards exist to maintain quality, not to exclude people, but to ensure that everyone present belongs. Victoria nodded approvingly at her son's words. The board specifically discussed this issue last month. We cannot allow our charitable intentions to be exploited by individuals who mistake generosity for weakness. The security guard stepped forward, his radio crackling with updates from the control room. Miss, we're going to need you to accompany us to a private area where we can resolve this situation properly. The other guests shouldn't have to be subjected to this disruption. But the disruption was already spreading beyond their immediate circle. Other guests throughout the foyer had begun to notice the commotion, their conversations dying as they turned to watch. The live stream viewer count had climbed into the thousands, comments flooding in from people around the world witnessing the confrontation in real time. Zara stood at the center of the storm, her composure unwavering despite the mounting pressure. She watched Harrison's performance with clinical interest, noting how he played to his audience, how each gesture was calculated to reinforce his authority while diminishing hers. "I find it interesting," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying, despite its measured tone, "that you assume I don't belong here. What exactly about me suggests that I lack the sophistication to appreciate music? The resources to support charitable causes? The breeding to understand social customs?" Her questions hit their target with surgical precision. Harrison's face flushed deeper, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an answer that wouldn't sound explicitly racist when broadcast to thousands of viewers. Victoria stepped into the silence, her voice sharp with aristocratic authority. "This isn't about you personally, dear. This is about maintaining standards that have served this community for generations. Some things are simply not meant for everyone. And who decides what's meant for whom?" Zara asked, her phone buzzing silently with updates from her team. "Based on what criteria? The color of someone's skin? The neighborhood they grew up in? The university they attended?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their collective prejudice suddenly exposed to harsh light. The live stream viewer count had climbed past 50,000, with major news outlets beginning to pick up the feed. Harrison made one final attempt to regain control. "Look, this has gone on long enough. You clearly don't understand the situation you've created here. I think it's best for everyone if you just leave quietly. No harm done." Zara smiled, reaching for her phone again. This time, the message she sent contained just 4 words: "Execute Phase 2 now." The foyer lights seemed to brighten as her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made her smile widen. "Dad, private line." She looked up at Harrison, at Victoria, at the crowd of faces surrounding her with their mixture of curiosity and contempt. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, not louder, but somehow more substantial. "I'm afraid it's too late for a quiet exit, Mr. Ashford. You see, I've been documenting everything that's happened here tonight. Every word, every gesture, every assumption you've made about me based on nothing more than my appearance." The crowd began to murmur, uncertainty creeping into their previously confident demeanor. Victoria's sapphire dress seemed to lose some of its luster as she realized that the young woman they had been dismissing might not be as powerless as they had assumed. "The question now," Zara continued, her voice cutting through their growing unease, "is whether you're prepared for the consequences of those assumptions. Because I assure you, Mr. Ashford, consequences are coming." The Lincoln Center director appeared as if materializing from the crowd itself, his usually composed demeanor cracked by barely controlled panic. Dr. Michael Chen had overseen the performing arts complex for 15 years, navigating countless crises with diplomatic grace, but the phone call he had just received had shattered his professional equanimity entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention," he announced, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that made the gathered crowd turn from their spectacle to focus on him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the foyer's climate control, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the center of the confrontation. Behind him walked a woman in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, her stride confident and purposeful. Elena Rodriguez, senior partner at Rodriguez, Kim and Associates, carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to wielding legal power in rooms full of wealthy men who underestimated her. Dr. Chen. Victoria Ashford's voice carried its usual imperious tone, though a note of uncertainty had crept in around the edges. Is there some problem with the evening's program? The director's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Ashford, I've just received a call from Marcus Williams. Perhaps you recognize the name? Harrison's face went several shades paler. The Williams name had been mentioned in every Ashford Industries board meeting for the past 8 months. Marcus Williams's media empire represented the future of entertainment distribution and the key to their company's survival in an increasingly digital landscape. He called to inquire about his daughter's treatment at tonight's event. Dr. Chen continued, his voice gaining strength as he witnessed the realization dawning on the Ashford faces. His daughter, who is standing right here among us, and who appears to have been subjected to the most appalling treatment I've ever witnessed at this institution. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice crisp with professional authority. Good evening. I represent Ms. Zara Williams and Williams Media Group. I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about Ms. Williams' presence here tonight. The crowd erupted in whispers, phones frantically Googling Zara Williams and Williams Media Group. The search results painted a picture that made their previous assumptions seem not just wrong, but catastrophically so. Images of Zara appeared on screen after screen, cutting ribbons at media centers, shaking hands with world leaders, accepting awards for digital innovation. Harrison's hands shook as he stared at his phone screen, reading article after article about the Williams family's estimated net worth, their media influence, their power in circles that made his family's old money seem quaint by comparison. That's... His voice cracked, forcing him to clear his throat and try again. That's not possible. She's just... Just what, Mr. Ashford? Zara's voice cut through his stammering with surgical precision. Just young? Just black? Just not what you expected someone from my family to look like? Victoria clutched her sapphire necklace as if it were a life-preserver, her aristocratic composure finally cracking under the weight of her mistake. There must be some error. How were we supposed to know? She didn't announce herself properly. I presented my invitation and identification multiple times, Zara replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had been there all along, though none of them had bothered to listen for it. I answered every question you asked. I complied with every demand. The only thing I failed to do was present my net worth as credentials for basic human dignity. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his face grave with institutional concern. Ms. Williams, on behalf of Lincoln Center, I offer you our most sincere apologies. This behavior is completely contrary to everything this institution stands for. Elena Rodriguez opened her briefcase, withdrawing a stack of documents with practiced efficiency. Ms. Williams, these are the preliminary legal filings we discussed. Given what's been documented here tonight, we have grounds for civil rights violations, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The livestream viewer count had exploded past 100,000, with major news networks beginning their breaking news coverage. Lincoln Center Gate was trending worldwide, the video clips spreading across social platforms with the viral velocity that only comes from witnessing injustice being corrected in real time. Zara looked at Harrison, whose face had gone from flushed anger to ashen realization. She looked at Victoria, whose sapphire dress now seemed garish under the harsh light of public scrutiny. She looked at the crowd of guests who had participated in her humiliation, their phones still recording their own shame for posterity. You asked me earlier what I do for work, Mr. Ashford, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent foyer. I serve on the board of Williams Media Group, where we're currently evaluating a $900 million partnership with Ashford Industries. Or rather, we were evaluating it. Past tense. The words hit Harrison like physical blows, each syllable stripping away another layer of his family's carefully constructed future. The deal with Williams Media wasn't just business. It was their salvation, the partnership that would transform their aging manufacturing operation into a digital age powerhouse. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice shaking with desperate panic. "Surely we can discuss this reasonably. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Mr. Ashford," Zora interrupted, her words final as a judge's gavel. "Just consequences. The same consequences that would have followed if you had treated any other patron this way, except that most other patrons don't have the resources to hold you accountable." The foyer had fallen silent except for the soft clicking of phone cameras capturing every moment of the Ashford family's very public downfall. The evening that had begun with their casual cruelty was ending with the collapse of everything they had worked to achieve. The aftermath unfolded with the inexorable force of an avalanche, each consequence triggering the next in a cascade of destruction that swept away years of careful planning and generations of accumulated privilege. By morning, the Ashford Industries stock price had plummeted 45% in pre-market trading. Marcus Williams's public statement, released at dawn through multiple major networks, was a masterpiece of controlled fury wrapped in corporate language. He announced not only the immediate termination of all negotiations with Ashford Industries, but also his intention to share his concerns about their company culture with other potential partners. Williams Media Group cannot and will not do business with organizations whose values are fundamentally incompatible with basic human dignity. The statement read, "Last night's events at Lincoln Center represent not an isolated incident, but a window into institutional attitudes that have no place in modern business." Harrison Ashford's phone hadn't stopped ringing since 3 a.m., each call bringing worse news than the last. 4 major suppliers had already announced they were reviewing their relationships with Ashford Industries. 3 investment funds had divested their holdings. The European Media Consortium that had been considering a joint venture had withdrawn from negotiations entirely, their statement citing concerns about corporate culture alignment. Victoria Ashford faced her own reckoning. The charitable boards that had once competed for her presence now scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The New York Philharmonic, the Children's Aid Society, the Whitney Museum. Each organization released carefully worded statements expressing their disappointment and announcing her voluntary resignation from their boards. The legal consequences proved equally devastating. Elena Rodriguez's team had worked through the night, filing a comprehensive lawsuit that alleged a pattern of discriminatory behavior extending far beyond a single evening's events. They had uncovered employee complaints dating back years, settlements that had been sealed, and a corporate culture that tolerated prejudice as long as it remained profitable. The FBI's Civil Rights Division announced an investigation into Ashford Industries' employment practices, their interest sparked by the viral video, but sustained by evidence of systematic discrimination. Former employees began coming forward, their stories painting a picture of a company where advancement opportunities, client assignments, and even basic respect were allocated based on skin color and social connections. Dr. Chen convened an emergency board meeting at Lincoln Center, where trustees faced uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in creating an environment where such behavior could occur. The institution announced a comprehensive review of its policies, mandatory bias training for all staff and volunteers, and the establishment of a diversity committee with real authority to enact change. The viral video had transcended social media to become a cultural moment. Late-night talk show hosts dissected every frame. News networks brought in experts on race relations, corporate culture, and social media's role in holding power accountable. The hashtag #TourLincolnCentergate spawned dozens of others as people shared their own experiences of discrimination in supposedly elite spaces. Harrison found himself unemployed for the first time in his adult life, his father having forced his resignation from the family company in a desperate attempt at damage control. The move proved futile. Investors and partners weren't interested in cosmetic changes when the fundamental culture remained unchanged. Victoria's social exile was complete and brutal. The women who had once competed for invitations to her soirees now crossed streets to avoid her. Country club memberships were quietly revoked. Charity galas that had once been unthinkable without her presence proceeded smoothly in her absence. But perhaps most devastating of all was the revelation that emerged during the legal discovery process. Internal emails showed that the Ashford family had been aware of their discriminatory practices for years, had calculated the cost of occasional settlements as acceptable overhead, and had actively worked to suppress complaints before they became public. The federal investigation expanded to include the IRS, which began examining whether Ashford Industries had improperly claimed tax benefits for charitable contributions while simultaneously engaging in discriminatory practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened its own inquiry into whether the company had properly disclosed potential civil rights liabilities to shareholders. Within 8 months, Ashford Industries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Its manufacturing facilities sold to competitors who promised to honor employee contracts and implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. The family fortune, built over 4 generations, evaporated in a matter of months. The personal cost proved equally severe. Harrison's marriage collapsed under the pressure of constant media attention and financial ruin. Victoria's health declined rapidly, the stress of public humiliation and social ostracism taking a physical toll that no amount of previous privilege could cushion. Their fall from grace became a cautionary tale studied in business schools, a reminder that in the age of social media and citizen journalism, institutional power could no longer protect those who wielded it irresponsibly. The name Ashford, once synonymous with success and influence in New York society, became a warning about the consequences of unchecked prejudice in positions of power. 8 months after that fateful evening at Lincoln Center, Zara Williams sat in the same foyer where her humiliation had unfolded, but the circumstances could not have been more different. The space had been transformed for the launch of the Williams Foundation's new initiative, Dignity in Every Space, a program designed to combat institutional racism in cultural institutions across the country. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now standing where the Stradivarius had been displayed that night, the same instrument her father had donated anonymously, the same piece she had been admiring when the first microaggressions began. Today, in its place, stood a powerful sculpture by Kara Walker, depicting the quiet strength of a young black woman facing an uncertain future with unwavering dignity. "People often ask me if I'm angry about what happened that night," Zara said, addressing the assembled crowd of non-profit leaders, theater directors, and civil rights advocates. "The answer is no, I'm not angry. Anger implies surprise, and nothing that happened that evening surprised me. I had experienced variations of that treatment my entire life. The difference was that this time I had the resources to respond." Her voice carried the same quiet authority that had been present that night at the gala, but now it was accompanied by the weight of proven power. The Williams Foundation had already distributed $60 million in grants to organizations committed to addressing systemic inequality. Theaters, concert halls, galleries, and opera houses across the nation were implementing new policies, training programs, and accountability measures. "But I want to be clear about something," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "This was never about revenge. Revenge would have been destroying the Ashford family simply because I could. Justice was giving them the opportunity to face the same consequences that ordinary people face when they engage in discriminatory behavior." The audience listened in rapt attention, many of them institutional leaders who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own organizations in the wake of the Lincoln Center incident. The video of that evening had become required viewing in diversity training sessions, a stark reminder of how quickly assumed privilege could crumble when exposed to public scrutiny. The real victory isn't what happened to the Ashford family, Zara explained, her tone thoughtful rather than triumphant. The real victory is the young woman who attended her first opera last week without being questioned about whether she belonged there. It's the family who visited the ballet without having their credentials challenged. It's the gradual recognition that cultural spaces belong to all of us, not just to those who have historically had the power to exclude others. Dr. Chen, who had kept his job after implementing comprehensive reforms at Lincoln Center, introduced the evening's final speaker. Marcus Williams took the podium, his presence commanding immediate attention. The media mogul rarely made public appearances, but tonight was an exception. My daughter has shown more grace in handling this situation than I might have managed, he began, his voice carrying the slight southern accent he had never lost despite decades in New York. She's chosen to turn a moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for systemic change. That's the measure of her character. He paused, looking directly at his daughter with obvious pride. But I want to address something that's been bothering me since this whole situation began. People keep talking about how wrong it was to treat Zara poorly because of who her father is, because of our family's wealth and influence. That misses the point entirely. The audience leaned forward, sensing something important coming. It would have been equally wrong to treat anyone that way, regardless of their background or resources. The problem isn't that they discriminated against the wrong person, it's that they discriminated at all. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they're the daughter of a media mogul or someone working 3 jobs to afford a theater subscription. His words resonated through the foyer, a reminder that true justice extends beyond individual victories to systemic change that protects everyone. Zara returned to the podium for her closing remarks, her expression serene but determined. Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter, not just for the institutions represented here, but for all of us who believe that dignity is a right, not a privilege. The work ahead won't be easy, but it's necessary. She looked out at the diverse crowd gathered in the same space where she had once stood alone, facing a wall of prejudice and assumption. Change is possible. Justice is possible. But only if we're willing to do the hard work of examining our own biases, challenging our own assumptions, and creating spaces where everyone truly belongs. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Zara wasn't finished. I have one final announcement tonight. The Williams Foundation is establishing a permanent fund for legal representation for individuals who face discrimination in cultural and educational institutions. No one should have to fight these battles alone, and no one should be denied justice simply because they lack the resources to pursue it. As the evening concluded, guests mingled in the foyer, their conversations focused on implementation rather than inspiration. Theatre managers compared notes on policy changes, opera house directors discussed accessibility initiatives, symphony orchestras shared strategies for community outreach. The transformation was real, measurable, and ongoing. What had begun as one woman's refusal to be diminished had become a movement that was reshaping institutions across the country. The evening that had started with casual cruelty had evolved into a force for systematic justice. The impact of that March evening at Lincoln Center continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing institutions in ways that even Zara couldn't have anticipated. 2 years later, the Lincoln Standard had become shorthand in non-profit circles for comprehensive anti-discrimination policies backed by real consequences and genuine accountability. But perhaps the most meaningful change occurred in spaces far removed from concert halls and charity galas. In a community center in Brooklyn, a group of teenagers attended their first chamber music concert, without being questioned about their presence. In Detroit, a young Latina family enjoyed their first opera, welcomed by ushers who had been trained to see diversity as strength rather than threat. In Houston, an elderly black man donated a collection of jazz recordings to a music library where staff members honored his contribution rather than questioning his credentials. These moments happened without fanfare, without viral videos or hashtag movements. They represented the quiet victory of normalization, the goal that had always been more important than any individual triumph or revenge. The Ashford family had long since disappeared from public consciousness, their downfall serving as a cautionary tale but no longer generating headlines. Harrison had eventually found work with a small consulting firm, his expertise in manufacturing still valuable despite his tainted reputation. Victoria had moved to a retirement community in Florida, where her past remained largely unknown to her neighbors. They had become footnotes in a larger story about change, accountability, and the power of refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. Their personal tragedy served a greater purpose, though they probably never understood it that way. Zara continued to lead by example, using her platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The Williams Foundation's work had expanded beyond cultural institutions to address discrimination in healthcare, education, and corporate environments. Each new initiative built on the same principles that had guided her response that night at Lincoln Center: documentation, accountability, and systematic change. The live stream that had captured her humiliation now served as a teaching tool, analyzed in classrooms and boardrooms as an example of how individual courage could catalyze institutional transformation. But Zara rarely watched the video herself. She preferred to focus on the future rather than relitigating the past. On quiet evenings, she sometimes returned to Lincoln Center, walking through the halls where her journey had begun. The Stradivarius had been returned to its place of honor, but now it was accompanied by a plaque acknowledging the institution's commitment to ensuring that all visitors could appreciate its beauty without fear of judgment or exclusion. Standing before the instrument, Zara would remember the woman she had been that night, angry, hurt, but determined not to let ignorance and prejudice have the last word. She would think about the people who had stood with her, the allies who had emerged from unexpected places, and the changes that had followed. Most importantly, she would think about the future, about young people who would grow up in a world where dignity wasn't conditional, where belonging wasn't determined by appearance, and where justice was possible for everyone, not just those with the resources to demand it. The evening that had begun with casual cruelty had become a foundation for lasting change. Sometimes the most important victories were measured not in headlines or hashtags, but in the quiet moments when equality became so normal that no one thought to comment on it. That, Zara knew, was the real goal. Not just justice for herself, but justice as a given, dignity as a right, and belonging as a birthright for everyone. The work continued. One conversation, one policy, one changed mind at a time. The revolution hadn't been televised after all. It had been live-streamed, documented, and shared until it became impossible to ignore. And that, perhaps, made all the difference.